What level of government involvement in the economy would you still consider to be consistent with a free market?
Hello. Welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to have on another guest who knows a lot about freedom and liberty, but also pensions, the budget, taxes, and how responsive we are to changes in the taxes, and maybe even, a little bit about the pandemic and pensions and other things. It's going to be a great discussion overall, and it's none other than Dr. Josh Rauh. Josh, welcome to Let People Prosper show.
Thanks for having me on, Vance. What a great name for a podcast.
Hey, well, I appreciate that. There's a lot of good discussion. We could go in a lot of different ways, and you're kind of a wealth of knowledge in many ways, Josh. But before we get into that wealth of knowledge, let me go over your bio for the audience, and then we'll jump right into it. So Josh is the Ormond Family Professor of Finance at Stanford's Graduate School of Business and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He leads the Hoover Institution's state and local government initiative. He formerly served at the White House, where he was principal chief economist on the President's Council of Economic Advisors from 2019 to 2020, during a time when we were both there. So we had for that discussion. Exactly. And taught at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business from 2004 to 2009 and the Kellogg School of Management from 2009 to 2012. His research focuses on government pension liabilities, corporate investment, business taxation, and investment management. His research has received national media coverage in many outlets. Prior to his academic career, he was an associate economist at Goldman Sachs in London. He received a BA from Yale University and a PhD from MIT, both in economics. So, with all that stuff going on, Josh, why do you do what you do every day?
Well, thanks, Vance. Thanks for the question. For me, as somebody who researches and talks about and writes about economic policy, economic policy is really supposed to be there for the prosperity of the people and for the prosperity of people in a democracy. And I think what really motivates me is trying to assess, where is economic policy? Are they getting it right in any way, or are they actually sort of failing to give people a system that is going to allow them to be prosperous? And so that's why I love the title of your show. It's very much kind of consistent with what inspires me to work on economic policy. It should really be about prosperity. And I kind of worry that that economics, the field in which I've worked in for 20 years since I got my PhD, has lost the thread a bit and has become very technocratic and has sort of lost the forest for the trees. Yeah.
Great points there. I share a lot of that concern as well. Too often I think we get caught up in a lot of the math and a lot of the modeling that goes on, but we forget about the assumptions and the principles of economics that have been rooted in what some call mainline economics, but in this feeling of, we come from supply and demand, human behavior, and the interaction of people, and too often it becomes more of a fine tuning of this machine, right? That we get to see. I wonder, from your background and everything, how did you get to this place, though, where you wanted to study economics? Was there a particular book? Was there a class? And this idea of prosperity that is so instrumental into our everyday lives, what really got you thinking in that direction?
I know, I when I started out, starting out at MIT, I think, I was very interested in how households, how individuals, build financial resources for themselves, for retirement, for their long-term future. I was interested in the institutions that exist in the United States that allow them to do that, retirement savings vehicles like 401ks and their defined contribution retirement plans, and the contrast between that and, say, these big, unfunded, already at that time well known to be totally unsustainable fiscal programs, government programs. And so those are the types of issues that really got me interested in economics. And I recently gathered with some folks in Boston to celebrate the 65th birthday of my advisor, PhD advisor, Jim Paterba, who's the president of the NBER right now. He's definitely, you think of him as being a mainstream economist. He's a professor at MIT, and he has advised over the years 93 PhD students he's produced to do research in various areas of tax, pensions, fiscal policy, things like that. And there's a lot of healthy debate and disagreement among that group of people, but he's a very inspiring person for him, because I think he takes a very analytical lens to these things. I think over the time that I've worked on this, my views about how the field of economics has sort of become very, very technocratic and has kind of failed to provide the people with what is good government for the people. Those have evolved sort of separately through my experience. I think working on research topics that do have big impacts for public policy or are very related to individuals' well-beings, such as retirement savings, these pension plans that the government provides, and so on. And I think that's where I kind of built my views about that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, that's important for all of us and for the overall economy as well. One of the things that you mentioned in there about thinking analytical about these things, I remember, given that we were both in the White House at the time, the Trump White House, we would have discussions between, I was at OMB, you were at CEA, and there was a lot of discussions that we would have about different issues, not even getting into the pandemic and stuff yet. But one of the things I always appreciated about you, Josh, was your analytical thinking. Like, you were always questioning when we were sitting around the table. I remember some of the big tables that we were sitting around. You were always pressing to get down to those major assumptions and maybe what the implications are. Is that something that you normally do all the time, or because I really loved it when we were there?
Well, look, I always try to get people to think about the big picture, and I think those are the questions that I tend to try to ask. And I think in our the seminars that we have in my department here at the Stanford Graduate School of Business or at the Hoover Institution, I definitely tend to do that as well, and I ask questions that try to sort of broaden that to the big picture. I mean, I do this in my teaching as well. I mean, to get a little bit to the topics that we're talking about. I mean, one of the questions one thing I like to do with students, I like to start out with polls of students just to figure out what people actually believe. Yeah. And so one question I ask people is, what level of government involvement in the economy would you still consider to be consistent with a free market system? 10%, 25%, a third, a half. Most people at sort of, U.S. universities, I've done this with a lot of different groups of folks, it sort of tops out at around a third. I mean, they sort of say, look, the government's spending more than a third of GDP. That doesn't really feel that much like a free market economy, especially when you consider the fact that, government spending as a share of GDP, that's not the only government involvement in the economy. They're also involved through regulation and a lot of other ways. Yeah. So then when I reveal to them that in 2021, the U.S. government spent 45% of GDP, and maybe for 2022, when the OECD harmonized numbers come out, it's going to be a few percentage points lower, but it's still well over that 33%, roughly a third, that most people think is consistent with a free market economy. So people are often surprised at that, and then of course they're surprised at just the extent of the unfunded debts that we have from the national debt, plus all the unfunded obligations to Social Security and Medicare. Yeah. Great points. And speaking of the topics that we want to discuss today, I kind of wanted to start with the big one, the big elephant in the room, being spending. Government spending on a number of different areas, like you just mentioned. When you look at state and local and federal government, around 45% of GDP. But I like the way you put that, even more than that, when you include regulatory costs and things of that nature. You're exactly right on that. I wonder, what are some of the areas that you dig into most on the spending side that we've got to get control over to really turn the tide for this massive amount of spending that's coming like a wave toward us, a tidal wave? I think the first thing to notice is that I've come to the conclusion that we're kind of getting a bad deal here in the United States for what we're getting out of our government. I mean, you can compare that 45% to some other countries out there that just do a lot more with lower levels of government spending. I mean, if you look at the OECD, a couple countries that have tangibly lower levels of government spending than we do, include, one is Switzerland. If you ever go to Switzerland, you look at, they've got these train systems that completely run on time. They've got, things work there. They have a lot of access to public programs themselves, but these programs basically, they work. And, Switzerland that same year, they spent 36% of GDP. The government spent 36% of GDP, and that is, they're just getting a lot more out of that, and that's going to be lower when the new numbers come out. So I think focusing on what are we actually getting, and Switzerland is an interesting case because of the very decentralized system that they have. For the U.S., our version of federalism is that the federal government does about 2/3 of the spending, and state and local governments do about 1/3. For Switzerland, it's reversed, and I think that competition among the local governments, their version of states, what they call cantons, there are, is very helpful. Another country that is obviously been in the news a lot lately, that spends less than we do as a percentage of GDP, is Israel. I mean, this is stunning, given that Israel has to spend a significantly larger share of their government expenditures on defense than we do. I mean, it's a country that has to deal with national security in a much more direct and constant daily way. A lot more of their government spending is on defense, and yet in 2022 they spent 37% of their GDP on total government spending. So I think, again, just going before we drill down to specific things, I think big picture. I just think in the United States we got to take a step back and ask, how can it possibly be that we are spending so much, so the government is controlling and spending so much of our resources, and yet we're getting so little from it. And what we get from these systems, people are not satisfied with the public education that we get. They're not satisfied with Medicare and Medicaid, either, the people who are on them. And the sort of health economics profession has been trying to run away for a very long time from the basic results of things like the Oregon Health Experiment, the RAND study. They kind of show that people who, get on these programs, it's very expensive, but their health doesn't even really improve. So, I just think, big picture, that's why I want your listeners to really think about it. And are we getting a good deal here? Well, we're not getting a good deal here. And people try to excuse this by saying, well, U.S., it's bigger or it's more diverse. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. Those are excuses for inefficient government.
Yeah. Yep. Well put, as usual, Josh. And for the audience, I told you, he always thinks about it a different way. Because I wasn't expecting to go that way. And then as you started going, I was like, yes, that's exactly what we needed to know more about. How I think you're right? We're not getting the best bang for our buck as taxpayers for the amount that we're spending and everything else. How should we start evaluating that? I mean, is it through efficiency audits? Is it through something? Because as you know, it's very difficult to turn the tide on so many of these programs to eliminate bad programs and everything else. But how can we start that process of weeding through the layers of the onion?
Yeah, it's a great question, and in answering, I'll try to go back a little bit to the previous question you asked me that I didn't answer very directly, which is what are some of the areas of government spending that I've studied a lot and dug into. And one of these areas is this area of a government employee compensation, and in particular, government employee pensions. So you say the word pension, it sounds like a very wonky topic, but what it really is these are the ways that governments circumvent rules that they set for themselves to try to have a decent fiscal balance. Mm-hmm. And so, I've studied this at the state and local level a lot, where currently there are about $5 trillion of unfunded debts and liabilities due to promises that governments have made to public employees about retirement benefits they're going to pay. Government employees can retire at a much earlier age than you or I. They can take a pension from the state. And, sort of from a conceptual standpoint, there might not be anything wrong with that if the state is properly reflecting the costs of that. But this was sort of my entree into how state and local governments really, they don't properly measure the costs of these things. And so by doing it in sort of this backdoor way, it's not that we're paying public employees, overpaying them in current compensation now, although some are overpaid in current compensation now. But mostly the problem is that we're paying them in deferred compensation and sort of pretending that the money will just be there in order to pay for that. And it's similar to Social Security, where you have a system where, we promise specific amounts of benefits to people, and we have formulas that payroll taxes that determine how much the government's going to take in. And well, if these things are out of balance for a while, we build up a bit of a surplus, like as we have in the past decades. Now that surplus is running down, and in 2033 it's hitting zero. And so that's going to be a point of reckoning where we're going to have to either start finding other sources of revenue to fund Social Security, or benefits are going to have to be cut. And so I think, to get a handle, I mean, there's some basic, just kind of, paying attention to stuff that it would be great if we demanded our government officials do. And I think, getting a handle on this stuff means demanding that we, demanding honest accounting and honest appraisals from our government officials in terms of these programs. And so I think that's maybe sort of a kind of economics answer. I just think, politically we really need somebody to just come along and basically do what in some ways, not in every way, but in some ways what Javier Milei in Argentina has done, which is basically come along and say, you think that there's all the money is there for Social Security and Medicare, but I have bad news for you. You've been lied to, and don't shoot the messenger. It's not my fault, but I'm just telling you, I'm going to shoot straight with you and tell you the truth is it's just not there.
Yeah.
And that's something that takes a lot of political courage to do. I don't know if the U.S. is ready for that. I think Argentina has had, sort of decades of real decline. We thought our inflationary burst was bad. They've been dealing with that for decades. So maybe the situation has to get a lot worse and people have to suffer more. I hope not. Yeah. It would be better if we could just wake up now and realize that we're on exactly the same path. It's just a matter of time. It'd be better if we could fix things now.
Yeah, totally agree. It was great what Milei's been able to do there so far. He's got the political will and just kind of flying through. It'd be great to see that here in the United States. Unfortunately, I think it will take maybe a crisis. Don't let a crisis go to waste, but maybe in a way in which will benefit, make it more stable for the fiscal front and the economy over time, unfortunately, and that's what it seems to be to come to. I love what you just said there, because don't let a crisis go to waste. One of the things I was sort of kind of disappointed about from the time around the time that you and I were in government was that the sort of emergency COVID packages were not used as also an opportunity to say, okay, we're going to spend a lot of money now, and there were reasons that they wanted to do that. Some of which I don't think were that well founded, but nonetheless, okay, they wanted to do that. Those are political decisions. But why not use those opportunities to also say, okay, we're going to spend the money now, but we're also going to sort of reform these programs in the sort of the same, kind of the same package, the same set of new laws going forward to put them on better footing. And I think, if you look at something like the UI system, right? I mean, when I was at CEA, around towards the end of the time that I was there, there were discussions about what's the additional unemployment insurance that's going to be offered to people during COVID. And what ultimately came out of that was increases in unemployment insurance generosity that during COVID created replacement rates of 150%, meaning that you could make 50% more money by staying home. And obviously those were excessive. They could have been also used as an opportunity to say, well, let's look at the program overall. And I know it was an emergency. I know people were in a rush. The government wanted to do things, but let's make some changes to this program, to the financing of this program that are going to have long-term positive benefits for the program. Yeah. Or with Social Security. I mean, I had a proposal that I made after the time at CEA that if people needed even more liquidity than the government had given them after the stimulus checks, after all the extra unemployment insurance, after all of these things, that they could borrow against their future Social Security payments in order to get those if they really wanted them now. And that would have been something that would have improved the actual long-term funding of Social Security based on the way that we had constructed what the what the payments would be and what the associated revenue streams would be. So that there was no, unfortunately, in crises, I wish there were more thinking about
okay, maybe we have to spend a lot of money now, or maybe there are political reasons to do it. I don't know, but can we at least get these programs on a better footing for the longer run? That's what I wish we would do when we think about not letting a crisis go to waste.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think something else that we should be looking at is, there was a lot of deregulation that took place in that time, where if it's not good during a crisis, why is it good at any time? Right. And there were some, especially a lot of states, did remove some of those regulations. But I think more of that could have been done. I talked to John Taylor recently from Hoover, and, his number one thing that he talked about to really let people prosper was to deregulate. He kept mentioning that time and again, just the huge cost, to your point earlier, that we don't even account for most of that cost within our GDP calculation and the cost of that and everything else. And I just think it's so important that we should have learned a lot from those lessons. And, you and I were both there during the pandemic and in the White House discussions, and not necessarily get into all that happened and transpired. But I know for my sake, I was talking out against us locking down. I was talking against, internally of the checks that were being sent out, especially when we were giving it to people who keep their job. A lot of people were keeping their job and working from home. And then they had all this excess savings that were going on. And we were ratcheting up massive deficits, over $3 trillion under the Trump administration, just in that short period of time. And then Biden took it on steroids and said, you know what? It worked under Trump, so let me go ahead and do it too. So we added more checks. Yeah. And just keep it going. It's amazing to see what happened during that time of this big government mentality. People can't fend for themselves. We've got to come up with ways to make sure that they stay safe and everything else. And I get it from a political perspective, but as we are economists and thinking about trade-offs, it was just mind-blowing to think about the trade-offs that weren't being considered during that time. And I don't know what all you'd like to share, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to do so, whatever you'd like to share from that time.
Well, I totally agree with you. As you know, internally, I was appalled at a lot of this stuff. One thing I will share is that before I went to the CEA, I joined in fall 2019. I planned to stay. I got a year's leave from Stanford initially, so I planned to stay for a year initially, and then reevaluate. So that was kind of the initial time there. I made a pact with myself because I basically said, I know of other people who have gone to CEA or gone into other advisory positions with the government, and then suddenly there have been massive expansions of government spending. For example, during the great financial crisis, and I made a pact with myself that said that I would not be around to rubber stamp massive expansions of government. They were unwarranted because that's not why I was there. I knew I was walking into a situation where already the government was running $1.5 trillion deficits. That was bad enough to be associated with, quite frankly, as a sort of fiscal hawk myself. But I was not going to let myself rubber stamp that, because having had conversations with folks and knowing, I think people who were around during the time of the financial crisis, I have great respect for people who put their foot down, and I also know folks who didn't. And another episode from history that I think very much motivated me was Marty Feldstein. Marty Feldstein is a Harvard University economics professor who I think is he passed away a few years ago. Extremely influential, and was the last public finance professor who really thought about things the way that I would think about them. He emphasized questions like, what is the overall deadweight loss from government, from taxation, the level of taxation we have now? How much are we losing in surplus, or I would say in prosperity would be a translation of what he said, for every dollar that we raise in taxes. And Marty Feldstein, as I understand the story, resigned from the CEA in the Reagan administration because of a budget deficit that was going to be about $100 billion, which seems very quaint by today's standards. So I think I went into it a little bit, already thinking, if something really big happens and I feel unable to make a difference in terms of reducing that spending internally, that I would resign, and that is what I did. I think some of the things that were going on, I quit before the CARES Act was finalized, but it was after the Family's First Coronavirus Response Act, which I guess all told ended up only costing about $192 billion. I mean, that, I can't believe we're saying the word only there.
Right.
But, it had stuff in there that I was not happy with. Like, okay, first thing we're going to do is we're going to, jack up the federal Medicaid assistance percentage again to 66% in a lot of cases. Why? I mean, states are sovereign entities. They're able to raise taxes. They're able to generate revenues from fees. Why are we there? And they were in good fiscal shape, as was ultimately proved ex post. Why are we just immediately assume we're going to bail them out of that? Another one I was hugely against internally that I was trying to talk to folks about was the airline bailout. Why did we throw $25 billion at airlines? And also Boeing. Why did we throw $25 billion at Boeing? These companies, ultimately, when we were bailing those companies out, we weren't bailing out their employees because we had already bailed out employees in the rest of the economy. We were bailing out their investors, and particularly the institutions that bought their bonds. I mean, you look at the airlines in the United States. The airlines you and I have flown on, whatever, United, Delta, American, they've all been through a Chapter 11 bankruptcy proceeding in the past 20 years, and most of the people in the flying public don't even know it. And those proceedings, what they do is they allow the debt to be haircutted, the airline to keep running, and for restructuring without some external force needing to come in and bail them out. So as a finance professor, I was super against that, ultimately just seeing the tsunami of spending coming. I mean, even the sort of, small, 10-foot wave of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act was enough to sort of trigger my promise to myself that I would run. Ultimately came out of the CARES Act was order of magnitude worse.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you probably received some pushback from what you did, but I really hold that in high regard. I think principles need to overcome politics so much more often throughout our society. So I really appreciate what you did. I stayed a little bit longer. I was there until May, but then I had to leave too. I was like, I gotta get out of here. Got to get back to freedom in Texas and everything else. But it was a remarkable time that you learn from it, and you hope we don't do it again. And I think those of us who were there, maybe have a different opinion compared to some others who may be listening to this, who were there also. I think it's important to have these debates and look at the questions, look at the assumptions, like the questions that you like to ask, Josh, so we can learn what to do and ultimately what not to do in the next time this happens.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I respect people who stayed even though they disagreed.
Sure.
I know there are a number of them, and for them, the ones that I knew, I think they, their argument to me would be, look, what they were doing by staying was they're serving their country. This is what the country has decided, what the politically vested, the entities vested with political power have decided, and it's if you're here, it's your role as a public servant to see that through, and also to try to be able to make some improvements around the margins. And I have no doubt that people who stayed perhaps were able to do that. And so I have a great amount of respect for people who might stay on, even though things that are going on are not totally consistent with the principles that they had coming in, but where they're saying, look, I think that I can make a marginal difference here. And so I have nothing but respect for those folks as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Good discussion there. Let's jump back into some of the other policy. I want to talk to you about taxes. I know this has been more of your latest work on state taxes. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Laffer curve. But you've been doing some work lately in California. I'm in Texas, so there's always this debate and rivalry between what's happening in California versus Texas. But what does some of your latest research show? What's happening in California?
Well, the thing is, if you want to study the effects of tax policy, and particularly income taxes, you can't do it in Texas because Texas doesn't have an income tax.
Amen.
You study other amen. You can study other taxes. But I've had a long-standing project that I think kind of initially I started trying to be able to get the data to do this over 10 years ago now. But it took years to actually be able to get the data sharing agreement signed and have the data handled under the appropriate security. To analyze California state income tax returns in light of the very, very large increases in the top bracket marginal tax rate. So for individual income. So Texas, no individual income tax. Your top bracket marginal tax rate for individual income is 0. In California, it is now 14.4%. 14.4%, just California. Okay, so, when I travel abroad and stuff, I've explained to folks, that's just California. That's on top of, federal 37% plus the payroll taxes plus and so on, because that's just California. So California did a big increase that effectively for high earners, so these were singles earning more than $500,000 and married couples earning more than $1 million, raised the rate by around 3 percentage points. So we had a very substantial and sudden increase in the tax burden, and based on the base rate that prevailed at that point, either 9.3% or 10.3%, depending on where you were in that, increased the total tax burden for taxpaying state by around 30 or 40%. Of their state level tax burden. So the one question that the media asks a lot, and a lot of people ask, well, does that lead to people moving out of California? And that's something very tangible. You can see it right there. The moving trucks pull up. People move from California to Texas. It obviously happened anecdotally. And with these data, I was able to show that, in fact, the bigger tax increase that you got slapped on you, the more likely you were to leave. And there were these big spikes in departures. So that was kind of nice, but maybe didn't surprise that many people. I mean, there were some deniers who were saying, no, the moving trucks are a myth, but most people knew what was going on there. But the much bigger thing was, what about the people who stay? What about the people who stay? And the people who stay, what we found out was that the people who stay, the ones who were hit by this tax increase, the evolution of their taxable income, of the income that they're generating, slowed down a lot relative to control taxpayers who lived in other states who are not hit by this. And a unique aspect of these data are that we're able to look at non-residents of California who have to file a tax return for some reason. And those are because we're always trying to deal with the problem of treatment and control. How do we assess causality? Yeah. And so the way I got the idea for this was actually when I was a professor at the Kellogg School of Management back in 2010 in Illinois. I was invited to come out to California and give a talk for something. I was paid I think $500 for a day as an honorarium for something that I had done, and discovered at the end of the year that I had to file a California tax return because of that, and I had to pay taxes in California on that amount. And what the idea that this brought to mind is the fact that there are a lot of people out there who are not in California. They're not affected by California tax policy. They're not thinking, okay, if California raises this rate by a few percent, am I going to give a talk in California or not? But they're in these data, and so this allowed us to do something really unique, which is to look at how top earners respond to the income tax. And some people might think, okay, top earners, why do you care so much about these people who are earning so much money? Well, in California, those people pay more than 50% of the income taxes. And that's also the case at the federal level. The top 1% pay 42% of the taxes. And so what we found was that there was a massive taxpayer response among these people to changes in the tax rate. They founded fewer businesses, they worked less, they reported less income, perhaps due to shifting it to other places or other time periods. And so that the state of California did not bring in nearly as much in tax revenue as they assumed that they would bring in if there had been no behavioral response. And it all kind of got masked from the perspective of the state because the entire country was experiencing a pretty big upswing around this time, particularly around 2016, 2017. You look through that time, and California is experiencing kind of a tech boom. But if you compare the people who are in California relative to other states, these high earners, they were going along parallel for until that big tax increase hit, and then the California people dropped off, and those in other states kept going. And so you mentioned the Laffer curve. Yeah. Which was this idea developed by Arthur Laffer in the 1980s, that there is a tax rate that maximizes the revenue the government can bring in. If the government tries to raise taxes too much, the tax rate too much, they will bring in less revenue because people's behavioral response, they're exiting, they're not founding businesses, they're reducing their economic activity, their tax avoidance. That will reduce the amount of revenue that the government brings in by so much. And that was a great insight that there might be a maximum there. I found in California at the time, back at the time when state taxes were still deductible under the federal income tax code, before the SALT cap, the so-called SALT cap, that California was not quite at that time over the top of the Laffer curve, although within 2 years, I saw that over 60% of the revenues that they would have gotten without behavioral responses were eroded. So they weren't at the 100%. They weren't at the top of the Laffer curve. Although it stood to reason, and we did some calculations on this, that now that those state taxes are not deductible under the federal code anymore, that California is probably over the top of the Laffer curve. But what's super interesting about this is that this came out not just in California income, but also in taxpayers' federal income. And so it's suggestive of, what would happen if the federal government increases tax rates by three percentage points. It turns out there are really big responses to that, and this experiment gave us a chance to measure it. And
nice.
I'll say, one thing that this whole project got me thinking about, though, was the Laffer curve is a nice concept. It's an important question to ask. What's the highest rate the government can set before additional increases in tax rates are counterproductive from a revenue standpoint? But what it misses is the question that Marty Feldstein was asking back in the 90s that I was referring to before, which is how much prosperity are we actually giving up just under the current tax code that we have? In order to get to a point where you're at the top of the Laffer curve, you have already discouraged a lot of economic activity. And Marty Feldstein's calculations back in the 90s were that for every dollar the federal government raises in tax revenue, they are discouraging $2 of economic activity. They're creating $2 of what we call deadweight loss, of lost economic activity, which I would translate to your viewers as saying in lost prosperity. And those are the questions that economists, I think, have stopped asking, unfortunately. It's very unfortunate because it's a very technocratic question to answer. What's the maximum rate that the government can set to maximize their revenues? What kind of question is that? How about what's the tax code that we can set, the government that we can establish that will optimize prosperity for people, given some constraints that there are going to be some indigent people who need to rely on government programs. That number is not going to be zero, but that we should be thinking about things in that framework instead of having a debate about whether the top what the marginal tax rate is that will maximize government revenues. The sort of mainstream economists have been very happy to play that game as well. That they jumped in after they don't refer to Art Laffer very much, but they jumped in and said they think that the top marginal tax rate that optimizes revenues is 82%. That's the Saez, Piketty folks. That's the number they give, 82. They're happy to play the game and say we think that's what maximizes tax revenues, and then others of us do studies and say no, it's something way less than that. But still, what about prosperity? Why are we asking this question? How does the government extract the most from the people? How does the government provide the most prosperity to people, or help create a framework where people can create the most prosperity for themselves?
Yeah, no, I love that. I love the way that you're putting that because we do often look at from a appropriators or a Ways and Means chairman or just government in general, what their perspective is, how to maximize tax revenue, how to increase spending to match all the needs that are coming in. And I kind of do the same thing. You're doing it from the taxes. I do it from the budget side. What's the average taxpayer's ability to pay for government spending? I don't care how much spending needs to grow for healthcare and education, but what's coming out of the productive private sector, that's really what we should care about. And it's one of the reasons why I've been so big on fiscal rules, where you have a spending limit, based on population growth plus inflation or whatever the measure is going to be, but have a rule in place that's going to best measure the average taxpayer's ability to pay for that spending, not the share of GDP, because I don't know that we're at the right share of GDP anyway, at 25%. I think that's way too high.
Way too high for the federal government.
And then if you have to come up with a tax system to fund it, well, you're already getting off the wrong leg, if you will, by going towards too much government spending to begin with. And one thing I wanted to mention earlier on Switzerland doing such a good job is they've had this Swiss debt brake in place for a long time. That has helped to keep their spending in check compared to a lot of other places. And we see this in the States, even in what's blue Colorado now, it was purple for a while, but they've got a good, Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights, a good spending limit in place. And so if we can get more control over the spending side, I think this will also help with our taxes and, to your point, help with our level of prosperity. So that way we're not looking at what's the best for government, but what's best for the people, right? Isn't that kind of where you're heading with that?
Absolutely. And, these fiscal institutions that you talk about, these, state level at the states, different states have different stringencies that they impose upon themselves. That is vitally important. And the federal government has none of that. They don't impose, any discipline really upon themselves. And so, I do think that there's a lot to be learned from states. I think, the studies that I've done of states, these unfunded pension obligations, these have been ways of circumventing some of those rules, but some states have been better than others. Some states have not circumvented these rules by nearly as much, and so I think that there is much to learn from that. And I think that's exactly right. I think we have to think about how can we create institutions so the government will constrain itself from doing things that are ultimately going to be very destructive to freedom and prosperity.
Yep. As we're wrapping up here, we've got a couple more minutes left, Josh. Kind of coming full circle, with your thoughts of building into where you're at today and all the work that you've been doing and different ways of helping improve our life with life, peace, prosperity, and everything else. What are you excited about for the future? If you are, so I've had some people say, well, I'm pretty dire on the future, but what do you feel like we could best be doing to let people prosper?
Well, I mean, hope springs eternal. I still hope that some politicians will come along, either maybe at the state and local level initially, maybe ultimately at the federal level, and just tell people, we need a complete change, and that will somehow speak to folks. I worry that it's just too easy to promise people stuff. I mean, that's how people tend to get elected. They promise you some stuff. We promise you some stuff. We'll never touch Social Security or Medicare. Right, this is how people seem to be getting elected. It's the game right now. But I wonder whether the American. I actually, I believe that the American people, by and large, don't really like to be lied to, and they don't just want to have smoke blown in their faces and be told stories. And that my hope for the future is that some of these that the truth may prevail, and that through showing people what's actually going on, and being really having people be really transparent about it. We have totally, the way that we have your show, we have all these sort of democratized presentation of information that hopefully we can sort of break through on that. I'm also, another thing I'll say that I'm optimistic about is, there are many people that are very, very sort of afraid of new technologies or afraid of AI, for example. And the thing you hear all the time is AI is going to destroy so many jobs, and look, the robots are already doing such a great job of, making coffee and all these things, and we're doomed. I don't believe any of that. I think there have always been waves of technological revolution. People have always been worried that those waves of technological revolution would eliminate jobs, and it always does end up hurting some people. It does hurt people who did those jobs, but ultimately, new opportunities come along, and it means that there may have to be new types of training or what have you. But I mean, look, we've gone through there didn't used to be any machines before the Industrial Revolution. I mean, I actually think that technological advancements like that are not scary, but are actually have a great potential. Obviously, they come with downsides and with things that have to be considered, and particularly AI. I think there's some security issues that have to be addressed. But by and large, when I see these kinds of technological revolutions happening, I think, those are ways to make economic production more efficient, and those could be tailwinds that could really help us as we address these very serious issues of government debt that are a looming disaster unless we do something. Yeah.
Wise words, Josh. As usual, you're always pushing the envelope, so keep that going, and God bless you and your family.
Thank you to you too, Vance.
Hey, thanks a lot, Josh. For the audience, I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I know I did. Please go out and give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to this, on whatever platform it may be, and share it with your friends and family. They might enjoy it too. And until next time, let people prosper.